Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, as the shadows lengthen and the world outside sinks into its deep velvet repose? We turn our minds now not merely to the concept of rest, but to the very history of slumber, seeking to understand how the men and women of the ancient twilight world of medieval Europe laid down their weary heads and surrendered to the mysterious realm of dreams. The Dark Ages were truly dark, not just in their societal challenges, but in the physical reality of the night, where artificial light was a costly luxury, meaning that life itself was utterly dictated by the strict, unyielding rise and fall of the celestial sun. When the day's work ceased, whether toiling in the cold, damp fields or meticulously copying scrolls in the scriptorium, the medieval world embraced an early darkness, for to burn precious oil or tallow candles for hours was an extravagance few could afford to sustain. Thus, the rhythms of the house and the village slowed dramatically almost immediately after the evening meal, often concluding well before the 7th hour had sounded from the local church bell tower, pulling all living things into an enveloping quietude. Sleep was not seen as a singular, unbroken event, a straight line from dusk until dawn, but rather a flexible, segmented ritual that acknowledged the body's need for both deep rest and silent contemplation. This first phase of rest was known by the gentle, simple name of the first sleep, and it began immediately upon the ceasing of labor, often while the embers of the hearth still cast their last flickering golden glow upon the mud-packed floors. Within the humble peasant's cottage, the act of sleeping was fundamentally communal, dictated by the necessity of shared warmth and the confined space of a single room where animals often huddled beside their masters for mutual benefit against the biting cold of the deep winter months. The bed itself was often merely a low, raised platform or a simple pallet of thick cloth sacks stuffed tightly with straw, dried leaves, or sometimes coarse chaff, requiring regular replacement lest they grow damp, moldy, or become infested with unseen crawling pests. Family members, apprentices, and even traveling guests might all share the generous width of a large wooden bed frame, or they might simply lay their bodies down upon the floor nearest to the banked fire, drawing comfort from the proximity of other breathing souls in the overwhelming dark. Privacy, that modern invention, was virtually unknown in these small, crowded dwellings, where the only separation between daily life and the descent into slumber was the closing of one's own eyes against the persistent, murmuring background noise. For the lord or the high-ranking cleric, the sleeping chamber offered slightly more luxury, yet even within the towering stone walls of a well-fortified castle, the air remained notoriously cold and damp, demanding heavy layers of fabric and fur for protection against the persistent chill. The grand, heavily carved beds of the nobility featured thick wooden posts and often included a canopy draped with heavy velvet or intricately embroidered wool, which served the vital purpose of trapping precious body heat and protecting the sleeper from overhead drafts or falling debris from the open rafters above. However, despite the visible trappings of wealth, such as feather or down mattresses replacing the rough straw, the sleeping arrangements were still surprisingly public. Servants often slept on the floor beside the noble's bed, ready to attend to any need or alarm throughout the unpredictable hours of the long night. The central, defining characteristic of the medieval European night, transcending all boundaries of class, was the deliberate interruption of sleep, a period known as the watch or the waking hour, which typically occurred around the deepest, quietest part of midnight, several hours after the initial rest. Following the conclusion of the first sleep, which was often the deepest and most dream-filled, the sleeper would naturally rouse from exhaustion, finding themselves fully alert and ready to occupy the dark hours with quiet, meditative tasks before returning to the warmth for the final phase of rest. This waking period was utterly sacred and free from the demands of daylight labor, a still point in the turning world that was considered the ideal time for deep spiritual reflection, quiet prayer, or tending to essential domestic duties that required absolute concentration. During this profound hour between the two sleeps, a time often documented by chroniclers and referenced in ancient literature, many households would stir briefly back to gentle life, though the volume remained low and the movements slow and purposeful, respecting the sanctity of the darkness. Wives might quietly mend clothes by the faint, rosy light of the banked fire, or they might prepare ingredients for the morning's bread, while husbands might check on the livestock or the security of the outside door, perhaps even visiting neighbors who were also awake during their own watch. It was considered the prime time for marital intimacy, free from the exhaustion of the day and the demands of the immediate morning, and it was also a favored hour for intellectual pursuits, with scholars reading or writing by a low, rationed lantern, utilizing the silence for maximum focus. The very air during this midnight watch was thought to be thin and spiritually charged, making it a critical time for religious contemplation, a belief cemented by the strict nocturnal schedule practiced within the monasteries that peppered the European landscape. Monks and nuns across the continent diligently observed the canonical hour of matins, often rising from their hard pallets in the deep chill of the night to chant prayers and perform vigils in the dimly lit chapels, marking the passage of time according to the ancient, immutable rule of Saint Benedict. This unwavering commitment to nocturnal prayer reinforced the widespread cultural notion that the darkness was not merely an absence of light, but a powerful, often dangerous realm where the boundary between the material world and the divine or demonic realms was perilously thin. Following the hour of quiet activity and introspection, the medieval sleeper would settle back down for the second sleep, which was generally lighter, filled with a pleasant awareness of the approaching dawn, and lasted until the sun finally broke the eastern horizon. This second period was viewed as the true preparation for the day's labor, concluding with the rigorous ringing of the bell signaling the start of the next cycle of work and prayer, ensuring that the body was utterly rested and the spirit fortified against the stresses of the coming hours. The natural biological segmentation of sleep, so universal in that era, stands in stark contrast to the modern aspiration for a single, uninterrupted 8-hour block, reminding us that our ancestors lived in greater harmony with the ancient, fluctuating cycles of both the human body and the natural world. The fear of the night was a pervasive and legitimate concern that dictated many of the rituals surrounding bedtime, as the medieval mind populated the darkness with lurking figures, mischievous sprites, and the ever-present threat of demonic temptation or physical robbery. Before lying down upon the bedding, families would often recite specific, long-established prayers of protection, asking for the archangels to stand guard at the head of the bed, believing that the vulnerable state of sleep required divine intercession to ward off night terrors and harmful visions. The sound of the wind rattling the wooden shutters or the howl of a distant wolf became terrifying, magnified symbols of the chaotic forces that lay outside the precarious safety of the hearth and the protective circle of the praying family. Even the materials used for comfort carried social and spiritual significance. The common man relied on the rough warmth of locally sourced sheep's wool, which was scratchy but effectively insulated against the stone cold, while the wealthy might import softer linens and silks, a tangible marker of their distance from the earth. The very act of preparing the sleeping chamber, whether it involved fluffing the straw or smoothing the fine sheets, was a moment of transition, separating the harsh reality of the waking world from the temporary respite offered by the hours spent horizontal. The bed was more than just a place of rest. It was a stage for birth, illness, and the final moments of life, often witnessing the entirety of a person's most intimate existence within its familiar bounds, thus making the space profoundly sacred. As the first tentative light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in soft hues of gray and pale rose, the period of the second sleep ended abruptly, hastened by the sounds of the farm animals stirring or the clatter of the household preparing the morning fire for the day's work. The transition from the segmented rest to the day's relentless labor was swift, demanding immediate physical activity, a sharp contrast to the slow, languid waking of later eras that could afford to ignore the rising sun. The medieval European night, therefore, was not a mere emptiness, but a carefully managed period of dual rest and focused activity, a rhythm now largely lost to the relentless, illuminating demands of the electrified modern age. Yet, before that second, deeper sleep claimed them once more, there lay a sacred interval of wakefulness, an hour or two when the hearth glowed low and the world outside was silenced entirely by the velvet cloak of night. This middle watch, often referred to as the waking hour or used for the observance of matins by those pious souls near the monastery bell, was not a time of anxious waiting, but of purposeful, quiet contemplation, a space where the soul felt most attuned to whispers from the celestial spheres. In this profound stillness, when the distractions of the day were entirely suspended, many found clarity for decisions, or sought solace through prayer and reflection upon the events that had unfolded since sundown, turning their minds inward towards their eternal state. This period was crucial for the spiritual life, viewed as the most favorable time for divine visitation or the gentle mending of one's relationship with the Almighty, away from the clamor of earthly concerns. For the peasant woman, this waking hour might be devoted to quiet domestic necessity, perhaps gently stoking the banked fire so that it would not die completely before morning, or undertaking the delicate mending of garments that required the concentrated focus the daytime hubbub often disallowed. She might knead dough intended for the morning's baking with slow, rhythmic movements, relying more on touch than sight in the dim, smoky air, thus maximizing the productive hours afforded by the limited light. This brief return to activity was entirely organic and unstructured by the clock, dictated only by the body's natural cycle and the necessary preparation for the punishing demands of the approaching daybreak, ensuring maximum efficiency within the boundaries of natural light and shadow. The very silence of the house made this work meditative, a private transaction between the individual and the immediate needs of the family unit, distinct from the communal labor that defined the daylight hours. Among the nobility and those who were lettered, this nocturnal pause offered a rare opportunity for true intellectual engagement, utilizing the small, protected light of an oil lamp or tallow candle in the privacy afforded by the heavy bed hangings. A knight might review tactical maneuvers or dictated correspondence that required absolute discretion, while a noblewoman might study the illuminated text of a devotional book or manage the household accounts without the constant interruptions of servants and petitioners. The darkness served as a protective barrier, fostering deep concentration and allowing for discussions of serious import between husband and wife, matters too sensitive to be whispered during the bright, public hours when eavesdroppers might be lurking near the great hall's fire. It was a time when the mind, refreshed by the initial rest, was sharpest, capable of handling complex thoughts without the intrusion of external sensory noise, elevating the second half of the night to a privileged intellectual interval. Yet, the medieval night was not merely a blank canvas for human activity. It was rich with spiritual danger and the potential for insidious harm, lending a heightened tension to the period between sleeps. The veil between the seen and unseen world was believed to be thin in the dead of night, allowing entry to malevolent sprites, wandering ghosts, and the insidious temptations sent forth by demonic forces seeking to corrupt the unguarded soul. Charms and fervent prayers were whispered into the darkness before the final descent into the second sleep, securing the perimeters of the chamber with faith, often involving the signing of the cross over the mattress or the hanging of blessed relics near the headboard to ward off nocturnal visitors. Fear was a palpable presence in the medieval bedroom, for darkness represented not just the absence of light, but the absence of God's immediate, visible oversight, leaving the sleeper vulnerable to attacks upon both body and spirit. Dreams, therefore, were rarely dismissed as meaningless flickerings of the mind. They were considered serious communications, either prophetic warnings delivered by the Almighty or insidious deceptions spun by the devil seeking to sow doubt or despair. Interpreters, ranging from learned clerics to traveling wise women, were often consulted at dawn to decipher the complex iconography presented during the night's rest, determining whether the imagery portended future famine, personal fortune, or spiritual damnation. The nature of one's sleep, whether it was deep and dreamless or tumultuous and filled with visions, was often taken as a gauge of one's spiritual health and alignment with the heavenly realm, adding weighty significance to the hours spent beneath the blankets. A truly holy person was thought to be protected, their sleep peaceful, while a troubled sleep suggested either a hidden sin or the constant harassment of the powers of darkness attempting to breach the soul's defenses. The physical reality of the medieval sleeping arrangements, driven by necessity and architecture, further shaped the experience of the night, starkly contrasting with modern notions of solitary rest. For the vast majority, sleep was an intrinsically communal act, often dictated by the constraints of a single-room dwelling where family members, sometimes including servants or farmhands, shared the warmth radiating from a single hearth. Privacy was a luxury wholly unknown to the commoner, and the sounds of breathing, shifting bodies, and the occasional wakeful cough were the constant soundtrack of the night, demanding a high degree of tolerance and acceptance of others' proximity. This enforced closeness created a tight, interdependent social unit, where the well-being of one was directly linked to the warmth and security provided by the shared physical space, binding them together both practically and emotionally throughout the darkness. Even among the wealthiest households, where space was abundant, the concept of the private bedroom as a separate, designated chamber was still evolving, and the great bed often remained a semi-public fixture in the main hall. While surrounded by heavy, rich curtains woven of wool or damask, which provided a visual and acoustic barrier against the bustling activity of the hall's inhabitants, the lord and lady's sleep was still witnessed by servants and retainers sleeping nearby for safety and immediate access. The great bed, often large enough to host multiple people during childbirth or illness, acted as a secure sanctuary within the exposed architecture of the castle, simultaneously signaling high status and remaining a nexus of activity during both the waking and sleeping hours. These curtains, often meticulously embroidered and lined, were not merely decorative but functional walls, attempting to carve out a pocket of dignity and separation in an age that valued warmth and security over absolute solitude. The materials used within these enclosed beds themselves spoke volumes about the owner's status and their relationship to the natural world and trade routes, echoing the differences noted in the first sleep. While the common man might rely on fresh-cut straw or cheap chaff, periodically changed and smelling faintly of the fields, the nobility rested upon feather beds stuffed with the down of geese, a costly and luxurious barrier against the cold stone floor. Over these soft foundations lay the finest linens, bleached white through extensive labor, sometimes imported from Flanders or Italy, contrasting sharply with the coarse, undyed woolen blankets available locally to the villagers. The preparation of the noble bed was a ritual involving multiple servants, meticulously layering wool, linen, and often furs in the winter, creating a cocoon of artificial warmth and opulence designed to erase the harsh realities of the surrounding environment. Furthermore, the very temperature of the chamber dictated sleeping attire and methods, forcing inventive solutions against the brutal European cold that penetrated stone walls with ease during the long winter months. Simple houses relied heavily on the retained heat of the central hearth, compelling inhabitants to cluster closely together not merely for companionship, but for sheer physical survival during the deepest hours of the night when the fire dwindled to embers. Among the wealthy, methods included warming pans filled with hot coals slid between the sheets just before retiring, or the use of heavy robes and nightcaps, ensuring that body heat was captured and preserved against the unrelenting seepage of cold air through window shutters and ill-fitting doors. The battle against the cold was relentless, and the primary function of the bed, regardless of class, was fundamentally thermal, a temporary, shared furnace that made the long hours of darkness tolerable until the sun's return. This intimate struggle against the elements and the ever-present specter of spiritual malice fundamentally shaped the medieval psyche, embedding a deep respect for the returning light and the communal bonds forged in the shared dark. The rhythm of segmented sleep and purposeful wakefulness, enforced by the absence of artificial, pervasive illumination, fostered a different kind of vigilance, where the passage of time was marked not by mechanical accuracy, but by the internal needs of the body and the external dictates of faith and nature. The night was a temporal landscape demanding patience, prayer, and practical survival, a crucible where character was tested and the true priorities of life, warmth, health, and spiritual grace, became starkly apparent under the silent watch of the moon and stars. The quiet activities performed during that middle watch were acts of trust, reliance upon the promise that the light would indeed return, demanding that energy be conserved and directed toward the most essential tasks of survival and devotion. The contrast between the silence of the night and the immediate, clamorous requirements of the daybreak was dramatic, demanding an instant shift in focus and energy that left no room for hesitation or lingering drowsiness. Once the cock crowed or the bells began their insistent tolling for lauds, the household was expected to spring immediately to its feet, abandoning the warmth of the bedding for the cold, demanding labor that defined the medieval economy. There was no gentle period of transition. The necessity of fueling the body and preparing for the fields or the workshop demanded prompt, unhesitating movement, often before the sun had fully risen above the horizon to offer its full light. This abrupt transition underscored the medieval subservience to the agricultural cycle and the limited hours of true productivity, making the night's rest a restorative engine rather than a prolonged indulgence in comfort. Even the way the household extinguished the light upon retiring speaks to the era's cautious relationship with fire and the profound reliance on darkness. The hearth fire was carefully banked, covered with ash and dampened materials to ensure it would hold a spark until morning, a critical process known as curfew, derived from the French couvre-feu, meaning to cover the fire. This simple, nightly ritual symbolized the deep vulnerability of the wooden houses and thatched roofs to accidental blaze, and the reliance upon that single, enduring ember to reignite the life-giving warmth and light of the next day. The banking of the fire was the final act before deep rest, a quiet acknowledgement of dependence on shared resources and the hope that the small flicker of life would survive the long, cold hours of human vulnerability. The period between the two segments of night, often called the waking watch, was not merely an accident of uncomfortable bedding, but a culturally accepted and sometimes even cherished interval of quiet contemplation. When the body, rested from the initial fatigue of the day's exertion, stirred itself around midnight, the medieval mind found a unique space for reflection that the daylight hours simply did not permit. This waking interlude offered a chance to tend carefully to the banked fire, quiet a fretful child, or address the gnawing hunger left over from a meager supper, all done under the shared mantle of deep communal darkness, which momentarily leveled the rigid hierarchy of the day. The banking of the fire was the final act before deep rest, a quiet acknowledgement of dependence on shared resources and the hope that the small flicker of life would survive the long, cold hours of human vulnerability. For the pious, this dark middle hour was often dedicated to prayer, a profound communion with the divine, uninterrupted by the insistent demands of mundane labor. The solitary darkness encouraged a reckoning with one's soul, facing the fears and hopes that the bustling daylight kept rigorously suppressed. Monks and devout laypeople utilized this stillness to recite the nocturnal offices of matins, often performing their most intense spiritual work as the rest of the world slept, believing that offerings made in the depths of night held a special, undefiled sanctity. It was in this sacred nocturnal silence that scholars might pore over precious illuminated manuscripts by the dim light of a carefully shielded rush dip, wrestling with theological problems that required the utmost undisturbed focus. Yet, for the average peasant dwelling, the waking watch was as often marked by practical necessity as by spiritual endeavor. The pervasive chill that seeped mercilessly through the thin walls of wattle and daub demanded immediate attention to the banked coals, lest the sole source of heat vanish entirely before the arrival of the sun. Any domestic animals kept within the house for mutual warmth, a common medieval practice involving goats, pigs, or necessary poultry, might need calming or tending, their restless stirring a frequent and natural interruption to the fragile quiet of the home. Moreover, the constant low-level fear of intruders, whether human thieves or destructive nocturnal creatures like rats and weasels, made it prudent for the master of the house to rise and ensure that all simple doors, locks, and bars remained firmly fixed against the threats residing in the menacing shadows. The very configuration of the medieval sleeping space dictated this shared, intermittent pattern, as entire families, and often several unrelated servants or journeymen, slept together upon a communal straw pallet or a large shared mattress stuffed with chaff or wool remnants. Privacy, as we now understand it, was an entirely unknown luxury, and the intimate rhythms of breathing, turning, and occasional snoring became a collective shared soundscape. This meant that one person's unavoidable need to rise inevitably disturbed several others nearby, requiring a societal tolerance for movement and sound during the night that modern sensibilities would find utterly disruptive and impossible for true rest. Medieval physicians, guided rigidly by the ancient Galenic theories, viewed sleep not merely as simple rest, but as a critical digestive process necessary for properly balancing the body's four core humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They strongly believed that deep, continuous sleep, immediately following a heavy evening meal, could stifle the natural internal heat required to cook the food and properly convert it into nourishing fluids. This failure, they warned, encouraged the putrefaction of the body's vital substances, thus making the segmented night seem inherently healthier and more advisable, allowing the body a chance to address its needs and redistribute the humors before sinking again into deeper, restorative slumber. Beyond the physical discomforts of cold, hunger, and pestilence lay the powerful psychological apprehension of the deep night, when the protective veil between the known, safe world and the terrifying spirit realm was believed to thin considerably, allowing ingress to malevolent forces. The deepest shadows were populated not merely by natural darkness, but by lurking demons, restless, unquiet ghosts, and mischievous, often dangerous fairies eager to lead the unwary traveler astray. Every unexplained creak in the roof timbers, Every sudden gust of wind passing violently through the thatch was interpreted not as a simple natural phenomenon, but as the potential approach of a supernatural entity seeking to steal breath, corrupt the soul, or simply cause profound misfortune. In this anxious and highly observant environment, dreams held profound and immediate significance, often viewed less as products of a simple subconscious mind and more as direct communications, prophetic glimpses of the future, or potent warnings sent either by God or by deceptive trickster spirits intent on misleading the dreamer. Medieval dream interpreters and confessors alike spent significant time analyzing the intricate night visions of the populace, determining whether the complex symbolic imagery pointed toward future prosperity, divine favor, or a dangerous susceptibility to the devil's subtle temptations and earthly snares. It was the nature of the second sleep, often deeper and more relaxing after the long waking interval, that was thought to yield the most powerful and truthful dreams, thus subtly shaping the outlook and critical decisions of the day to come. While the ceaseless world of daylight commerce and constant chatter certainly ceased, the medieval night was paradoxically far from silent. The pervasive, dense quiet of the countryside was constantly punctuated by the echoing, ritualized calls of night watchmen patrolling the narrow, unlit lanes, announcing the passing hour and confirming that the heavily fortified city gates remained securely bolted against any potential midnight intrusion. Furthermore, the distant, eerie cries of nocturnal wild animals from the surrounding forests, the steady, rhythmic drip of water from poor roof maintenance, and the perpetual scuttling of rodents seeking warmth and discarded scraps formed a persistent, natural symphony of darkness that permeated the homes. These continuous sounds served as a constant, subtle reminder of the world's fierce, enduring presence, even when human eyes were tightly closed in rest and meditation. The rhythm of rest varied considerably between the isolated rural homestead and the bustling medieval town, though the fundamental segmented pattern universally remained dominant. In the deep country, the sleeping cycle was strictly dictated by the immediate needs of the farm beasts and the precise seasonal timing required to catch the dew for favorable planting or harvesting of vital crops. In contrast, the urban night, particularly in major trading centers near rivers or busy ports, was frequently disturbed by the heavy movement of night carts hauling necessary waste or the secretive, often clandestine commerce that sought to entirely avoid the heavy tariffs and intense scrutiny of the daylight magistrates and tax collectors. While the wealthy city merchant might secure greater physical comfort and finer linen sheets and blankets, he often paid for his monetary success with a noticeably noisier and more frequently disturbed cycle of rest than his distant, more isolated country counterpart, who benefited from the deep, enveloping quiet of the fields. Nonetheless, even these noble or wealthy urban dwellers adhered to the essential division of the night, bound by cultural habit and the perceived spiritual value of the middle watch. Their wealth provided a buffer against cold and pests, but not against the ancient, rooted pattern of human wakefulness. For the vast majority of the population, the mattress remained a simple, large linen tick filled with freshly cut straw, dried chaff, or aromatic fern fronds, requiring constant, burdensome replenishment as the contents flattened, grew dusty, and inevitably became riddled with small, persistent biting creatures drawn to the lingering warmth and decaying organic matter within. This necessity of meticulously changing the bedding, often coinciding with major seasonal shifts or important religious feast days, was a major, demanding household chore, and the genuine comfort offered by the straw was entirely fleeting. This constant, low-level physical discomfort ensured that truly deep, prolonged, undisturbed slumber was a rare, precious gift reserved only for the utterly exhausted or the very ill. Even within the lofty, heavily fortified walls of a castle or grand manor house, where thick woolen blankets replaced the rough sacking and feather pillows might soften the nightly blow, the underlying pattern of divided sleep persisted without deviation. The noble household was bound by the same insistence of the monastic bell for the communal nocturnal offices, and the vital need for vigilance against physical attack was only magnified by the great wealth and treasures held securely within the stone walls. While the lord or lady enjoyed the coveted seclusion of a curtained four-poster bed, designed specifically to ward off the harsh drafts that swept through the vast stone halls, they too frequently rose during the middle watch to discuss matters of strategic defense, conduct private religious devotions, or address the critical, pressing concerns of estate management that could not wait for dawn. After the waking interval passed, and the small, necessary duties or prayers were concluded, the household would settle back down into the collective straw for the second sleep, a period which was frequently described in historical accounts as the sweetest and most profound, a time of true and essential physical repair lasting until the first, gray light of dawn began to paint the eastern windows. This final, deeply coveted rest offered the truest psychological relief from the unrelenting physical strain of medieval life, allowing the body to gather its final, crucial stores of endurance before facing the long and demanding day ahead, a day which demanded ceaseless, heavy toil. The eventual, final call to rise was marked not by a gentle, welcomed transition, but by the rapidly brightening light and the distinct rising sounds of the awakening farmyard or the market square, the unmistakable, intensifying clamor of animals, tradesmen, and the insistent call of the church bell. This collective sound was the final, definitive signal that the brief, blessed truce with human labor had officially ended, and that the day's relentless obligations had begun their renewed, unhesitating clamor, pulling the weary population back into the cycle of production and survival under the morning light. The medieval body, having been nurtured by the warmth of the collective bedding and the deep respite of the second sleep, was reluctantly pulled into the sharp, unforgiving chill of the morning air, a tangible reminder of the season and the meager heating available in stone halls or wattle and daub cottages. There was little grace in the rising, limbs ached from the heavy labor of the prior day, and eyes strained against the dim light, necessitating the hasty rekindling of the hearth fire, which served as the true, warm heart of the dwelling and the immediate center of domestic activity, the point from which all essential activity radiated. For those in the monasteries, the ascent was marked by the solemn, synchronized march toward the chapter house or the frigid chapel for the matin service, ensuring that the first fruits of the mind were dedicated to God before they were given over to man's earthly concerns, thus sanctifying the difficult transition from rest to exertion. The utilization of artificial light during the brief waking hours before dawn was a stark indicator of social standing. Common folk relied almost entirely upon the sputter and flicker of rushlights, thin strips of soaked reed dipped in grease, which provided only a weak, smoky yellow glow that barely banished the surrounding shadows, forcing early tasks to rely more on muscle memory and touch than sight. Only the wealthy merchant, the great lord, or the cloistered scholar could afford the steady, bright burn of beeswax candles, allowing for prolonged work in scriptoria or council chambers where the precise details of charters or trade agreements needed careful scrutiny beyond the constraints of the rising sun. Thus, the day was truly regulated by the solar cycle, with human activity maximizing the natural gift of daylight, treating every precious moment between sunrise and sunset as an irreplaceable asset for survival and prosperity, a mindset deeply unlike the modern mastery over manufactured illumination. Chronic sleep deficit was not recognized as a pathology, but rather as an inherent condition of human existence, especially during the demanding seasons of harvest or warfare. The medieval mind accepted weariness as the natural consequence of piety and ceaseless labor, believing that true, unburdened rest was only to be found in the eternal embrace of the Lord after death had mercifully severed the earthly cord of toil. This constant state of semi-exhaustion arguably contributed to the famed medieval intensity and occasional volatility of temperament, where patience was often a scarce virtue, and reactions were quick and sometimes violent, born from nerves frayed by unrelenting physical demands and perpetually short, interrupted sleep cycles. Yet it also fostered a profound spiritual resilience and a deeply ingrained acceptance of suffering, allowing people to endure monumental physical hardships that would shatter the sensibilities of later, more rested generations, rooting their endurance firmly in the necessity of perseverance and stoic acceptance of fate. While the common laborer and his family huddled together in shared straw pallets or rough wooden beds for collective warmth, blurring the distinctions of individuality during the hours of darkness, the noble class sought to establish a fragile degree of private sanctuary, though they rarely achieved the true solitude that future ages would come to expect. The great four-poster bed, often hung with rich velvet curtains and piled high with feather mattresses, a visible, undeniable symbol of wealth, did not necessarily guarantee a lone occupant, often hosting immediate family members, trusted pages, or even favored retainers who slept upon trundle beds or nearby couches for security and immediate service should the Lord call out in the deep hours. Thus, even within the most privileged chambers of the mighty, the concept of sleep remained highly social and functional, always intertwined with the maintenance of physical order, the display of status, and the practical demands of nightly protection against sudden threats or emergencies. Thus, even within the most privileged chambers of the mighty, the concept of sleep remained highly social and functional, always intertwined with the maintenance of physical order, the display of status, and the practical demands of nightly protection against sudden threats or emergencies. Medieval medical theory, rooted firmly in the tenets of Galenic humorism, viewed sleep not merely as rest, but as a critical physiological process necessary for the proper concoction or thorough digestion of food ingested during the day, a crucial time when the body's innate heat withdrew inward from the extremities to complete this vital, stomach-centric chemical process. Physicians advised that one must not sleep immediately after eating, lest the digestive warmth be improperly marshaled and the humors be poorly mixed, leading to sluggishness and eventual chronic ill health, but neither should one delay rest too long after supper, lest the stomach remain cold and the vital spirits dissipate uselessly into the night air before their work was done. Furthermore, the preferred sleeping position was often dictated by specific health concerns, frequently recommending lying upon the right side for a time immediately after lying down, believing this aided the liver in its essential function before transitioning to the left, all carefully governed by complex, traditional calculations regarding the optimal balance of heat and moisture within the body's essential fluids. The hours of darkness, especially during the mysterious, transitional phase between the first and second sleep, were considered a porous time when the soul was believed to be most vulnerable to unseen external influence, often opening the mind to potent, sometimes terrifying nocturnal visions that felt frighteningly real. Dreams held immense spiritual and social weight, viewed not as random neurological events, but as direct, purposeful communications, either divine warnings delivered by saints, prophetic glimpses of the uncertain future, or insidious, tempting assaults launched by demons seeking to pollute the pious mind with corrupting or blasphemous imagery. The interpretation of these often vivid and demanding nocturnal visitations became a serious theological and social undertaking, frequently requiring the consultation of specialized dream manuals or the careful counsel of priests who were tasked with helping the bewildered dreamer distinguish between the pure heavenly messenger and the cunning, deceptive machinations of the infernal realm. While laypersons practiced segmented sleep out of practical necessity and biological rhythm, responding naturally to the waning of the fires and the demands of bodily functions, the inhabitants of the cloister formalized this pattern into rigid, unbreakable piety, structuring their entire day around the 7 canonical hours that demanded awakening multiple times throughout the course of the night. The strict Benedictine rule, which set the foundational standard for Western monasticism, required the brethren to rise while the world was deepest in slumber, often near midnight, for the solemn and lengthy recitation of vigils and matins, essential services intended to cleanse the soul and honor God in the quietest, most vulnerable hours of creation. This disciplined adherence to the bell's insistent command ensured that the monks acted as spiritual sentinels, maintaining an unbroken, prescribed chain of prayer and devotion that spanned the entire 24-hour cycle, thereby sanctifying time itself and offering spiritual protection for the wider, sleeping community outside the abbey walls. Despite the perceived deep quiet of the rural night, the darkness was rarely truly silent. The sounds of nervous animals shifting in their stalls, the rustling of straw beneath the communal bedding, and the subtle, habitual movements of the shared household continually punctuated the darkness, offering a rudimentary form of security through shared, collective awareness of potential danger. In the bustling, walled towns and cities, the night was guarded by the measured, reassuring tread of the watchman, whose distinct footsteps and low, droning calls reassured the sleeping burghers that the critical city gates were secure against raiders, and that fire, the ever-present scourge of closely packed wooden structures, had not yet taken hold. The fear of being robbed, or worse, burned alive in one's bed, necessitated a constant, almost subconscious state of aural awareness, meaning that the deepest, most secure sleep was often achieved not in utter silence, but in the comforting knowledge of nearby, familiar sounds of life, vigilance, and routine. The simple straw pallet, often filled with dried fern or rushes, offered a cheap and readily available base for sleep, yet required constant vigilance and maintenance, for it was a fertile ground for the unseen population of fleas, lice, and various crawling vermin, whose nightly assaults chipped away mercilessly at the quality of rest. Though the straw filling was regularly replaced, especially after the major seasons of harvest or festival, the pervasive presence of these tiny tormentors ensured that true, uninterrupted tranquility was a difficult prize to win, contributing to the persistent itching, tossing, and restlessness that often troubled the sleeping hours of the common folk. Over the pallet, rough woolen blankets or simple linen sheets provided meager defense against the penetrating cold and the discomforts beneath, emphasizing that the function of the medieval bed was primarily utility, shared warmth, and minimal structural support, not luxurious isolation or pampered comfort. As the sun finally crested the horizon, pulling the last vestiges of shadow from the floor and igniting the dust motes dancing in the increasingly bright air, the hazy, spiritual memory of the profound second sleep rapidly dissolved, giving way entirely to the immediate, physical, and inescapable realities of the day's obligations. The plowman grasped the often frozen wooden handles of his implement, the smith stoked his forge back into furious, hungry heat with the bellows, and the woolworker bent once more over the loom, all driven by the simple, ancient imperative of feeding the hearth and sustaining the lineage until the next scheduled temporary respite. Thus, the complex, interrupted pattern of medieval sleep concluded its necessary service, having momentarily repaired the strength required to face the monumental, continuous demands of a world measured not by mechanical clocks and precise minutes, but by the relentless, predictable turning of the sun and the indispensable cycle of labor and survival. This segmented existence bred a unique relationship with time, where the darkness was not merely an absence of light, but a space filled with specific duties and spiritual opportunities that were distinct from the tasks of the daytime. The hours between sunset and sunrise were divided into a sacred schedule, ensuring that even rest contributed to the order of the cosmos and the security of the soul. The very concept of wasting the dark hours was alien, for even when one was not praying or discussing business, the act of sleeping was considered an engagement with the natural rhythms of the world, restoring the balance of the body's heat and moisture in preparation for the coming struggle of the light. It was a life lived in stark awareness of the fragility of human energy, where every moment of slumber was precious, functional, and deeply interwoven with the fabric of communal survival. The morning ablutions, such as they were swift and pragmatic, often involving only a quick splash of cold water upon the hands and face, a necessary shock to fully banish the lingering mists of the second sleep and prepare the sensory organs for the demands of concentrated work. True, thorough bathing was a rare luxury for most, reserved for special feast days or specific medical treatments, meaning that the body carried the scent and grime of the previous day's exertions and the shared warmth of the night's rest right back into the renewed cycle of labor. Cleanliness, much like private space, was subordinated to the urgent necessity of production, reinforcing the understanding that the body was an instrument designed for continuous output, requiring minimal fuss and maximum endurance before it could be granted repose again. Even the earliest meal, taken quickly before the sun had fully lifted above the rooftops, was characterized by efficiency and fuel, often consisting of hard bread, perhaps supplemented by a weak ale or a thin pottage left over from the previous evening's cooking, designed purely to stock the body's furnaces for the long morning's work ahead. There was little lingering over the breaking of the fast. The collective need for immediate departure to the fields, the forge, or the market square pressed in upon the household, making the consumption of calories a rapid, businesslike prelude to the relentless pursuit of daily sustenance. The lingering warmth of the hearth was abandoned almost immediately as the workers stepped out into the crisp, often frosty morning air, beginning their trek toward the site of their required toil, leaving the domestic sphere to those engaged in the essential upkeep of the home. For the town dwellers, the opening of the market gates was the definitive signal of the day's official start, marked by the booming cries of the first vendors and the clatter of carts rolling across the cobbled streets, drowning out the softer sounds of the farmyard and replacing them with the intense, localized clamor of commerce. Merchants, having spent their middle watch, perhaps inventorying their goods or writing out complex accounts by lamplight, were now fully engaged in the lively, argumentative dance of trade, where quick wits and stamina were as essential to survival as the quality of the goods themselves. The energy of the marketplace was fueled by these interrupted, functional sleep cycles, contributing to the vibrant, often aggressive pace of medieval urban exchange that defined economic life. Yet, the memory of the profound quiet achieved in the depths of the second sleep, that brief, unified period of rest achieved by both body and mind, often served as a subtle, underlying psychological comfort during the most arduous hours of the day, a silent promise of future restoration. It was a rhythm dictated not by the tyranny of the hourglass, but by the deeper, ancestral pulse of human biology responding to environment and necessity, a sleeping pattern lost entirely to modern sensibilities that demand 8 hours of unbroken silence and isolation. This antique cadence ensured that even in the midst of the most desperate poverty or the heaviest labor, the night offered two distinct periods of refuge, making the darkness not an uninterrupted void of fear, but a structured terrain of segmented rest and necessary vigilance. The waking watch, occurring usually between the hour of midnight and the third hour before dawn, was far more than a mere interruption of rest. It was often a sanctified window of opportunity, a period granted by the cessation of earthly bustle for the deep communion of the soul. For the devout peasant or the cloistered monk alike, this interval was dedicated to tasks that demanded quiet solitude and unbroken focus, activities often impossible during the bright, distracted hours of the day when labor and commerce reigned supreme. It was during this dark, unburdened time that prayers were most sincerely offered, meditations were most profound, and the whispers of divine inspiration were thought to be most clearly perceived, unmixed with the clamor of the smithy or the demanding cries of the marketplace. The very darkness seemed to amplify the internal landscape, forcing a necessary introspection that the unrelenting light of day naturally resisted. Within the modest homes of the common folk, the waking watch carried a more practical, yet still intimate significance that stabilized the household. Mothers used the time to mend clothing by the careful, fragile glow of a rushlight, ensuring that the threads were strong and the seams held fast against the harshness of the coming day's toil. A quiet, essential act of foresight necessary for the survival of the family unit across the lean months. Husbands might tend to the weak embers in the hearth, banking the fire carefully so that the precious warmth did not utterly vanish during the most frigid hours, or perhaps share a low-voiced counsel with their older children regarding the management of the farm or the expectations of the local lord. These silent moments of shared labor and planning strengthened the familial bond in a way that the exhausting, hurried exchanges of the daylight could never permit, forming the true, unseen backbone of household economy and emotional stability. In the great monasteries that dotted the landscape, the segmented nature of sleep was elevated to a strict spiritual discipline, woven irrevocably into the very fabric of the canonical hours that ordered life from dusk till dawn. Monks rose dutifully from their first sleep for the offices of matins and lauds, often long before the deepest chill of the night had passed, marching silently into the chilly choir stalls where their voices would rise in unified, haunting praise to meet the still, silent heavens. This deliberate breaking of rest was considered a crucial ascetic practice, a willing denial of physical comfort that reinforced their devotion and kept the spirit sharp against the sluggish temptations of the flesh and the inertia of mere repose. Their entire existence was a testament to the utility of segmented rest, proving that the human body could thrive and the spirit soar when the night was properly divided into periods of rest, contemplation, and communal prayer, thereby sanctifying the nocturnal darkness itself. Outside the shielded walls of the cloister, or the stout oak doors of the fortified dwelling, the waking watch often held a far more tangible element of necessary fear and crucial vigilance. The medieval night was thick with perils both real and imagined, roving bandits who sought the cover of darkness for their violence, wild beasts emboldened by the shadows, or the subtle, creeping terror of pestilence, which was often said to move most freely under the cover of the cold, moonless hours. Watchmen pacing the high walls of the cities or the perimeter of the village had little choice but to segment their rest, relying on brief, intense periods of sleep followed by sharp, focused alertness to ensure the physical safety of those slumbering within the confines below them. Sleep was thus often a privilege earned by communal vigilance, and the waking watch was the heavy price paid for that brief, fragile peace, a duty often undertaken with a weary yet profound burden of responsibility for the community's welfare. For the rare scholar or the diligent scribe, often laboring in the service of a wealthy patron or the church, the waking watch provided the only truly undisturbed time for the strenuous pursuit of knowledge, a silent sanctuary illuminated only by the expensive, slow-burning wax candle or the flickering reservoir of an oil lamp. Copying intricate, sacred texts, deciphering ancient, complex languages, or wrestling with difficult theological arguments demanded an isolation that the crowded medieval household or the noisy lecture hall simply could not afford during the busy hours of the day. This solitary nocturnal labor often involved lengthy, continuous stretches of wakefulness, fueled perhaps by weak ale or diluted wine, transforming the waking watch into a private academy where the great minds of antiquity were met and debated in profound, humbling silence. Such essential intellectual effort cemented the waking watch as a period of profound creation, where the very foundations of Western thought and spiritual understanding were painstakingly laid, line by solitary, shadow-draped line. As the waking watch began its inevitable decline toward dawn, signaled perhaps by the first faint, silvering thinning of the darkest blue above the eastern horizon, or the solemn tolling of the bell for lauds, a new, deeper quietude would subtly descend upon the land. Having fulfilled their immediate duties, be they spiritual, domestic, or protective, the common folk would then purposefully prepare themselves for the deep repose known universally as the second sleep, an act of conscious and welcome yielding to the necessity of full somatic restoration. This second segment of slumber was nearly universally deemed the most restorative, the one that truly knit up the raveled sleeve of care and prepared the body for the heavy physical demands of the long, tiring day, a final, necessary immersion into oblivion before the sun's exacting and demanding ascent. The very quality of the second sleep was considered fundamentally different from that of the first, which was often viewed as a heavier, more brutish unconsciousness, intended only to dull the initial sharp edge of fatigue accumulated since the prior dawn. The second sleep, however, was frequently characterized by vivid, often instructional dreaming, thought by many to be direct communications from the saints, or even the subtle, guiding voice of the Creator, either guiding the sleeper toward moral rectitude or warning them of impending misfortune. It was perceived as a lighter, yet paradoxically deeper repose, a state of rest that seamlessly integrated the reflections and prayers of the waking watch, settling the psyche and ensuring that the final, critical hours before true waking were spent in necessary spiritual absorption rather than mere physical dissipation. To enter the second sleep was, in this view, to enter a privileged, sacred space where the heaviest burdens of the waking world were momentarily lifted entirely by grace. While the burgeoning urban centers inevitably embraced the structured noise and commerce that encroached early upon the restorative second sleep, the rhythms of agrarian life remained profoundly and stubbornly tied to the slow, deep linger of the nocturnal darkness. In the scattered, isolated hamlets and along the vast, exposed farmsteads, the waking watch might be significantly shorter, focused solely on the necessity of feeding livestock or checking the security of the property boundaries, but the second sleep was often permitted to stretch longer, pressing much closer to the visible break of dawn itself. Farmers required every possible moment of uninterrupted repose before tackling the back-breaking demands of plowing or reaping. Their internal clock tuned less to the insistent clangor of the city bells and more to the slow, relentless movement of the celestial sphere above them. Their fragmented night was therefore less about industrial preparation and more about sheer survival, a necessary negotiation between the primal needs of the exhausted body and the ever-present environmental dangers lurking just beyond the boundaries of the cultivated fields. The pervasive necessity of the segmented night was profoundly underscored by the extreme expense and inherently poor quality of artificial light during the entire medieval era. Rushing into the deep, demanding darkness with a task requiring sustained, clear illumination was simply not economically feasible for the vast majority of the population, meaning that the waking watch was often performed in near darkness, relying only on carefully stored embers or the diffused, weak light of the moon. Only the very wealthy could afford enough beeswax or fine animal oil to truly banish the shadows for hours on end, thereby gaining the precious ability to control their waking schedules more independently of the natural cycle of the sun and stars. For the great mass of the poor, the dark, long hours between first sleep and second sleep were an enforced period of quiet reflection, simply because the prohibitive cost of illumination prohibited rigorous physical labor or extensive reading. Medieval medicine, rooted firmly in the ancient, respected theories of Galen, viewed sleep not merely as a respite, but as a critical physiological process for the proper cooking and careful digestion of the bodily humors. The first sleep was understood to be the vital period when the heaviest, most demanding digestion occurred, settling the heavy food consumed at the evening meal and distributing the necessary moistness throughout the frame of the body. The waking watch, then, served as a crucial, necessary break to prevent the dangerous over-moistening of the brain, allowing the internal vapors to clear and settle, thus ensuring that the mind was not burdened by excessive phlegm when the body returned to the lighter, restorative process of the second sleep. This ancient philosophical and medical understanding lent a deep, necessary scientific weight to the segmented night, cementing it not just as a cultural habit born of necessity, but as a physiological requirement for true health and sustained mental clarity according to the accepted wisdom of the age. The experience of segmented sleep also served, in its silent way, as a stark, unavoidable marker of subtle social status, defined inescapably by the quality of the sleep environment itself. The noble family rested high above the ground floor, often in an enclosed, heavily curtained bed that provided a degree of privacy, warmth, and sound dampening entirely unknown to their lower servants or their peasant tenants. These wealthy sleepers might still rise for their necessary waking watch, perhaps to dictate letters to a waiting scribe, or enjoy a light, private repast, but they were protected entirely from the cold stone floors and the pervasive, constant drafts that afflicted the poorer souls who often slept huddled together on thin straw pallets near the kitchen hearth or even alongside the working animals in the deep warmth of the barn. Thus, while the fundamental rhythm of the segmented night was shared across all classes of society, the vital quality of the repose varied dramatically, influencing their subsequent ability to work, to think, and to endure the long suffering that the coming light would surely bring. The segmented night, therefore, created a shared collective consciousness across the entire medieval world, where countless souls, separated by status, great distance, and vocation, were all waking and working in unison during the very hours when the modern world insists upon its deepest, most profound quietude. They knew, though they could not speak of it with our clinical precision, that the period between the two sleeps was a time of communal vulnerability, of essential spiritual labor, and of silent, vital preparation for the unrelenting demands that the imminent daybreak would surely bring to their doorsteps. It was this silent, shared rhythm of waking and sleeping, punctuated by prayer, vigilance, and preparation, that subtly bound the diverse populace together, making the vast, frequently frightening darkness of the medieval night a manageable, structured, and profoundly spiritual journey toward the enduring promise of the next dawn. This pattern was not easily shed, even as new forms of illumination began to slowly trickle into the wealthiest centers during the late medieval period. The practice of dividing the night was so deeply ingrained, supported by theological conviction, medical theory, and social practice, that it resisted the subtle, nascent technological changes that might have allowed for a continuous 8-hour immersion into slumber. To the medieval mind, the idea of sleeping straight through the night was not necessarily one of luxury, but rather one of potential spiritual and physical negligence, a failure to heed the natural call of the body and the soul to rise during the quiet hours. The segmented night was therefore a mark of civilized life, a testament to the efficient management of both temporal and spiritual resources, a structured counterpoint to the wild, unstructured terror of eternal darkness that was constantly feared.